Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Developing Effective Multidisciplinary Teams for Tribal Communities. My name is Allison Friedman, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the Chat pod. Click on the name of the file and then click the Download button. During today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenter will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat pod as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Melissa Blazing from the National Criminal Justice Training Center at Fox Valley Technical College, to begin today's event.
Thank you, Allison, for that introduction. As Allison mentioned, my name is Melissa Blazing, and I'm a project coordinator with the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. The Amber Alert TTA program has partnered with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center to host this webinar for you all. In conjunction with our mission, this webinar and our entire regular Amber Alert webinar series works to bring together state, local, and tribal subject matter experts to present and discuss critical issues related to missing, abducted, and exploited children. To learn more about the Amber Alert program, our training and technical assistance opportunities, please visit our website link available on this slide. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to submit your questions via the Q&A box located on your screen, as we will answer these questions throughout the presentation. And without further ado, I would like to introduce and turn today's presentation, Developing Effective Multidisciplinary Teams for Tribal Communities, over to our presenter, Jim Walters, Program Administrator for the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. Jim?
Thank you, Melissa. I wanted to thank everyone for attending this afternoon's webinar. From looking at the list of attendees, I see some of our friends from the from NACA and from NCA and other practitioners that understand all too well the need for multidisciplinary teams in Indian country and some of the challenges that we've faced. As a practitioner in Indian country who has worked cases and gone through that process of trying to seek justice for victims, it is absolutely clear and imperative that one of the things that is needed is the ability for tribes to be able to create effective teams that are based on the community needs. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And while I look at the list of presenters and I can see that we have some experts, I see Jerry and Melissa and others there that have worked with the tribes, we have a poll question to ask how many of you have experience working with tribal communities. And we ask this because it is it's a unique experience. We're going to talk about some of the issues that are related to working in Indian country and some of the challenges that you could face setting up an MDT in Indian country that may be somewhat different from what we see working in other communities. If you see the poll, we're looking at about 3/4 of the participants so far have worked in Indian country before, and that's important because the idea of entering into something as significant to the community as an MDT is quite important, and the experience that your team brings to the table and the abilities that you have to integrate your program into that tribal community can be what makes or breaks your efforts. So with that, and I think we're looking at about 65% so far, which is actually a good number. With that, I want to talk to you a little bit about working with tribal governments and working MDTs in Indian country and some of the obstacles that we often face. You know, there are some misconceptions that we often run into when we're working with tribes and Native government. Those are essentially that tribes are just another racial minority, that tribal government, tribal communities are stakeholders like any other special interest group, or that we approach them in the form that we would a local government. And those things are issues that can cause problems from the onset. The reality is that tribes are sovereign governments. They were sovereign by nature before the Europeans came to North America and were conducting their own affairs and were acting as governments long before European settlers arrived on this continent. And in fact, if you go back to the U.S. Constitution, you will see that tribal governments are recognized as a sovereign governmental entity, and that is part of the approach that becomes so important when you initiate these activities to work in an Indian country. If you consider some of the issues that tribal governments have faced in the past, such as removals, there are historical context to great upheaval and removal of tribal nations from one part of the country to another. But during that movement, the tribes did not advocate their sovereignty. They did not give up their ability to govern their own people. And it's important to understand that tribal government looks at pre-existing rights and sovereignty as being part of their heritage. And we have to understand that when we work to enter into agreements and to work within the community. I think one of the things that newcomers often run into as an obstacle when approaching a tribal government or tribal community to work projects is understanding how leadership works in tribal communities. You know, there are essentially two types of leaders. There is the elected leader, and the rate of overturn of presidents and councils and chairmen and chiefs varies from tribe to tribe. It can be an election every year to an election every 4 years, and there's that constant turnover. The second facet that you always have to understand about working with tribes is that there may be traditional or spiritual leaders or elders within that tribe who are constant, and they're a constant source of authority, and a very important role is played by these individuals, and you have to understand that and have their buy-in and support to be effective in the community. There may be official consultations that take place, but you must always understand that involving cultural and heritage, religious issues and practices, you need to consult with traditional cultural and spiritual leaders to make sure that you're making the right approach and doing things the right way. If you can develop these types of relationships and get input both from government leaders and traditional and spiritual leaders, you're going to find that you'll have a much better opportunity for success with your program. I think it's important to understand in the context of working with these communities the history of child abuse and other issues that impact tribes. The reality is that in in historical culture in tribal communities, children were seen as the heart of the family structure. Much of the community was built around the child, and they were cared for by the entire community, by extended family, and so forth. In my family, it was aunties and uncles who may or may not have had any blood relationship at all, but we cared for children throughout the community. Now, child abuse certainly was not unheard of, but for most, it was unacceptable and unimaginable to harm children. Unfortunately, with the interaction between cultures, that traditional family structure began to break down in the 1860s to 1960s. Over that century-long period, there were some key issues like the Indian Adoption Project, which removed, a third of children from their families, and many of them were placed into positions in group homes and schools that were horrendous and wouldn't be heard of today. And during that process, language, culture, and practices were taken away from the children. One of the additional concepts that you have to understand when working with these communities is the issue of generational trauma. Centuries of exposure to racism, warfare, violence, catastrophic disease, all of these things can lead to family members, community members, where that they accept the negative issues related to their lives, such as poverty or maltreatment, as it's just the way things have always been, and it will make them less likely to cry out for help, seek resources, and makes it very difficult in a number of areas, such as reporting. Rates of victimization in tribal communities, for those that are not exposed to it, are often alarming, and in fact, I've been greeted with disbelief when we talked about the fact that Native children are as much as 50% more likely to become victims of sexual abuse than Caucasian children. American Indian, Alaskan Native women suffer from the highest rate of rape and sexual assault in our country. And all of these things have an impact on the psyche of the community. There was a study of 57 tribes, more than 100,000 people in 21 states, showed that only about 2/3 of the cases of known child abuse were being reported to the federal government. It's a challenge that we face all the time, getting good statistical data on the rate of victimization, on the rate of sexual assault, on the rate of missing children. All of these things are challenges that your NDT will face when working with these communities. We know from studies that family-related variables are shown to be factors in the community, in criminality and the activities of youth. And with these high rates of domestic violence, all of this is impacting the children that you're going to be working with. And one CDC report, which was the largest that had ever been conducted, 39% of Native women said they were victims of intimate partner violence. Telling is also the fact that almost 20% of Native men were victims of intimate partner violence, all of which leads to this accumulation of trauma in the community. Now you add to that issues related to substance abuse. We understand and know that issues such as low self-esteem, depression, anger, acting out behaviors are often seen in children that come from homes where substance abuse is the norm. And there's a direct correlation between incarcerated juveniles and substance abusing families, which again adds to that impact. Add poverty, isolation, jurisdictional issues, and you see you have a recipe there for a very difficult situation for the team. Jurisdictional issues, I mentioned that briefly. The dilemma that we often face in dealing with cases that arise in these communities is where did the crime occur, who is the victim, who was the assailant, and it can vary from case to case. And with the advent of technology and things of that nature, these jurisdictional variables continue. And that's one of the reasons, as we'll talk about in just a moment, the MDT is such a crucial tool in addressing those issues and providing services to the family. Case review is one of those key factors that are so important to tribal communities. As an investigator, I started my investigative career in a large police agency and was able to have access to a multidisciplinary process. And I remember that when I started handling some of my first cases that were tribal in nature, and the suspects and the victims maybe were different affiliations with the tribe, it was literally myself and a prosecutor. And I did not have the input of other organizations and other stakeholders to review those cases. And it's frustrating. And it also will tell in terms of the type of case that you can bring forward. This coordinated case review is essential. One of the things that you need to understand is that the makeup of a multidisciplinary team on tribal lands, it may have more or it may have different participating agencies than what you would find in a non-tribal program. Some of the dynamics of the community are going to make who you bring to that team different than you might find elsewhere. Generally, some of the core stakeholders that we need to have at the table are prosecutors, social services, law enforcement, health services, education in the community plays such an important role. And many tribes have unique community programs that serve youth or serve victims in the tribe, and each of those have to be considered. And always consider the fact of having available tribal members who can advise on cultural issues, especially as they impact victimization and wellness and healing in the tribe.
Jim, if I could just interrupt you for 1 second. We're just getting a little bit of static feedback. So if you could, I don't know if you have any electronics around you, if you could.
I don't have any.
But okay, go ahead, sorry.
Okay. One of the issues that we talk about very often is the need to earn trust. Because of the complex history that tribes have had with the federal government, you're going to have to earn trust, and it doesn't happen overnight. You will need to educate yourself on how tribal governments operate. You've got to demonstrate respect for their values and be proactive in your interest in tribal welfare. And I think most essential is following through on commitments that are made to the tribe. You've got to be respectful, predictable, and you've got to have credibility. If you don't have credibility, then there is no ability to continue because people will not follow your program. One of the things that we often talk about is who you're going to work with and the type of relationships that you have to develop. One of the things is that you need to initiate these partnerships early on, and the key is to listen to the people that you're working with. I had a good friend and a mentor who used to say that we're tired of people telling us what we need and what they're going to do for us. If you'll just listen, we'll tell you what we can do together. That's really important advice as you move forward. There are some unique needs when working with tribes. The first is to address those complicated issues of jurisdiction. Understand that you have to develop a community ownership, make the community feel that the program is theirs while you're sensitive to culture and tradition. And then understanding that the geographic area that you may be serving could be immense, and all of the issues that brings into it can be something that's going to impact your ability to deliver services. There are unique challenges that every MDT is going to face in this attempt to move into the community and work with the community. Cultural intervention, which happened prior to you coming along, is now going to be something that you have to deal with. The reporting aspects that we talked about, the lack of understanding of laws like child welfare laws outside the tribal community, and then of course resources, people that can specialize in one area or another, or infrastructure limitations. All of those are challenges that you're going to face. Understand that there are some assumptions that people often make that are a barrier to what you're trying to do. There's this distrust that may have been experienced having worked in tribal communities. Many of us have seen relationships that change over time with our local partners and our state partners and federal partners. There are issues with families and others from the community that may not believe or want to believe a child's outcry. I was in a meeting yesterday where the whole discussion was, how do you reintegrate a victim of abuse or exploitation into a small community, into a small tribal community, when everybody knows what has happened and the shame that child experiences. And then you're obviously going to be facing mistrust of the government and intrusion into local affairs. Tribes are traditionally understaffed, some by as much as 50% understaffed. The great distances that victims and witnesses often have to travel. I am in Albuquerque today to go to a sentencing for an individual that committed a horrendous crime against a young Navajo child. And family members are driving half a day or more to get to that court appearance. And that's just a reality. And you could face that no matter where you're at. And understand that the resources that tribes have to help move victims to and from appointments and meetings and so forth are often very limited, and it's the work of organizations like NCA and others that provides these resources and can help make the difference for a tribe that's trying to work with children. Think about jurisdictional considerations. A local, municipal, or county police officer has a case that occurs in their jurisdiction. It's generally going to be very clear from the onset whether the case belongs to them or to a federal agency based on where it happened and the type of crime. When you're looking at jurisdictional issues on a crime that occurs on tribal lands, it could be any number of agencies that have primary jurisdiction. You have to create a plan ahead of time that allows the MDT to be part of the process of helping with that case no matter what jurisdiction or agency carries on with the case. When you have an MDT that can provide a joint process for case review with federal, state, and tribal officials, and then a decision is made on how best to approach a case and how best to set jurisdiction for the success of that case and to protect the victim, then that is a huge resource that tribes are in desperate need of. Think about the impact on response. What happens when victimization occurs outside tribal lands? Maybe the report is made to tribal officials? What type of protocols can your MDT put in place to ensure that the MDT is included in those notifications? How do tribal agencies follow up to make sure that they work with the MDT? And then are we getting feedback from local, state, and federal agencies so that when a child is contacted off tribal lands, that everybody is involved from the onset in serving the needs of that child, even when they return home. So we have a couple of minutes to look at some of your questions and hopefully answer a couple of those that have come up. And I saw one that popped up just now that caught my attention, and it was, how do you hold MDT meetings when the FBI is located many miles away from Indian lands? That's an important question because it is a reality. And one of the things that you have to do is, as the MDT forms, is to create these memorandums of agreement and memorandums of understanding. We're going to talk a little bit about them in a minute, but it clearly defines the role of the MDT members and sets forth the need for members to be present at meetings no matter where they're at. And then for our partners at the FBI or other federal agencies, having knowledge that these are the days that we're going to meet and this is where we're going to meet, we can cut down on some of these issues related to travel, because it's difficult, especially when you have one or two agents that are covering multiple tribal areas and maybe multiple MDTs, that setting up the process ahead of time will provide a better foundation for getting them to those meetings. And also, don't forget about technology like we're using today. Things like Adobe Meeting, GoToMeeting, conference calls. If that's what you're left with, better to have somebody involved in the meeting remotely than not having their voice as part of the meeting. All right. So let's talk about one of the keys to the process, which is actually conducting an assessment. Every time that I'm approached by somebody who says, well, we want to do something for the tribes, and this is what we're thinking that we can do, you have to go through this discussion that you need to know what it is that you're looking at as far as problems before you start delivering resources. And the assessment is key to this. And one of the challenges is that conducting a needs assessment within a tribal community is not the same as it's going to be in conducting in any other community. So we've got another poll question up just to see how many have ever conducted a needs assessment within a tribal community. This is a unique challenge, and I'll talk about this in just a moment, because I know that I participated in a needs assessment early on in my career, where I had some very well-meaning folks that came in and conducting an assessment, and they left and they told us some of the things that we needed, and then when we sat down and looked at them for the area we were working with and the tribe we were working with, they were just absolutely unattainable. That is the reality, is that the assessment gives us an idea of what the needs are that are specific to that tribe, and that's what's so important. If you look at our poll here, you see that almost 87% of our participants have not participated in an assessment before, and that's not unusual. They're very difficult, time-consuming, and present some real specific challenges. We're fortunate that there's been a lot of work in this area that is helping us improve that process, and we're going to talk about As we move forward, we're going to talk about how we can best conduct these assessments and also keep our tribal members involved in that process so that we can learn from it as we move forward. Let's talk about why we do these assessments. First off, you've got to have a system. There's got to be a system for how you gather this information. You know, one of the realities of the work that we do is we're held accountable for how we use our resources and our personnel. And one of the things that an assessment does is it allows us to have a logical use of resources and we can show the need for the things that we're doing. I think even more important is that it will help us pinpoint the reasons that we're there. It'll find those gaps in the system, which may differ from tribe to tribe, and it will help your MDT look at new needs for the future so that you can stay ahead of problems that are happening in tribal communities. As a brief example, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we didn't have to deal with the regular issue of children that were exposed to exploitation and child sex trafficking. That is, with the advent of technology and a lot of things, that is at the front of a lot of issues that tribes face today. And so these assessments can look at that stuff before it comes to us, and it can give us a heads up and help us prepare. We have to understand that the assessment's not an end unto itself. It captures the needs of the community at one moment in time. And so it's an ongoing process. We want to identify gaps in services. We also want to look at what are the barriers to successful investigation and prosecution. They may differ, but it's important that we understand the best way to deliver services to our victims. And an assessment has to be actionable. We could all create an assessment outcome that says we need more money, we need more resources, and we can't do anything till we get those. And that assessment's of no use to us. We have to have an actionable assessment so that we can move forward with serving these communities. The idea is to create this understanding of the challenges that you're facing as you develop your MDT and as you move into the community so that you can focus on those obstacles and have a better outcome. You've got to ask yourself, what's unique about this situation? What's unique about this community when we come to this community? Why aren't victims coming forward? Why aren't we getting services to victims? What happens to a victim when they do report? Is there advocacy in place? How does it treat the victim? What are law enforcement attitudes? How does law enforcement perform? What are medical agencies? What are the resources that are available? We want to look at all those things ahead of time. And then ask, what is your competency? Where are your strengths as they relate to your MDT in terms of your stakeholders, the people that are going to make up the MDT? What kind of community support can you expect? Does the tribe and does your MDT have policy in place that supports the concept? Does local law enforcement and advocacy centers have procedures and practices in place that support the MDC concept? And I think most important is everyone trained to utilize that process and the resources that you're going to bring to the table. I spoke briefly about MOUs and MOAs. Once you have these partner agencies and you identify who's going to be brought to the table, you've got to formalize agreements. One of the challenges, and I know that a lot of you would echo this, one of the greatest challenges that we face is sustainability. With programs that die, with a new tribal council, with a new chief of police, with a new head of the CAC. So getting agreements in place that ensure that the program survives are critical. And memorandums of agreement and memorandums of understanding are contracts to tie that stuff into place. And that is key. You've got to outline in these agreements for how you're going to approach everything, which includes starting with the assessment, so that when you enter into that assessment and you begin that process, that you are already partnering with the tribe. Make sure that before you start this process that you have the approval of tribal council. I've been involved in programs before that maybe have found a strong voice in the community, maybe a law enforcement official who has said, yeah, we want to do this in our community, and they start a program, but it's without approval of tribal government, and the program falters, gets shut down, or otherwise doesn't succeed. So we enter into agreements before we start this process. You know, I can't overstate the need for guidance from elders and cultural leaders in all facets of your MDT, but especially in the assessment process. There are a lot of strengths and resources that tribes have that are going to be specifically helpful to creation of an MDT. And one of the things that you have to do to access those resources is seek out those members in the community who are experts in this area. They could be tribal leaders. They could be people with special skills and special knowledge. There are cultural immersion programs, healing and wellness programs that they have knowledge of that we don't see as much as we should outside tribal lands. And it varies from tribe to tribe. In some places it's elders. You may have warrior chiefs, religious leaders, but every tribe has those individuals. And if you incorporate early on the practices of the community and aspects of health and healing and that holistic approach, you're going to find a much more successful ability to integrate and assess in that community. NCA provides an assessment tool which should be the foundation of your assessment. It provides that consistency that is so important in data collection, adhering to best practices, and then it allows you to customize your assessment so it meets the needs that are unique to your community. This is an example that you're looking at of the NCA MDT assessment tool. Some of the things that you find here that you're not going to find on other assessments, such things as who's the primary law enforcement agency. Is it a tribal agency? Is it Bureau of Indian Affairs? Is it an agreement with a local or state officials? Something of that nature. What kind of training do your interviewers get in terms of cultural language, tradition, social structure? All of those things are unique, and I challenge you to not just look at this information. Look at what you have, and one of the things that I would say is that if you have a child advocacy center or a needs assessment that you've developed in tribal communities, to share that. This ability to work across programs is so important because you're going to have to create something that fits where you're working at and who you're working at. One of the things that we have found successful and others have as well is listening. Create a listening session. Go into the tribal community, bring in community members and listen to them. Get their feedback as you go into it. Bringing together focus groups of child protection officials from within the community. One of the things that especially is important when we're justifying what we're doing is looking at data. And while data is hard to come by in Indian country, if you can map the data that is available, you can look at the assets and resources that are out there so that you can show the community what you bring to the table and what the community brings to the table and where the gaps are, it's much more effective when you do that assessment. Then go into the community, be part of the community. You know, when my team does an assessment, we don't just go in and come out. We set up meetings before we go into the community. We do introductions with tribal leaders. We do listening, and then we stay there. We spend days on site so that you can get to know people and you can get to understand the dynamics. Some of the best information that you'll gather on an assessment won't be from the official sitting across the table from you. It'll be from the person that you talk to at the local cafe or someplace like that. So be out there and get unbiased information from members of the community. One of the things that is important is understanding the uniqueness that comes with these tribes and the fact that you are going to have variations from one community to another. And sometimes, and I saw the message, the reference to the fact of all the tribes in New Mexico, you know, 26 tribes and pueblos, and the fact that every one of them is different. And there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And so your assessment, it may have to cover more than one tribe and may be unique for each tribe if they're in your area. The reality is the assessment has to reflect the community. And you've got to base what you're doing on the specific needs of that community as well as their unique culture. And from tribes that are very close geographically, they can have very different problems, challenges, and resources. There are areas in the Southwest, for example, where you have tribes that are just a couple miles apart, but because of natural resources or gaming or physical location, the problems that they face and the resources that they have can be drastically different. And your MDT may be serving both of those tribes. So it's important that you understand that and conduct your assessment with that in mind. Who is your service population going to be? Are you serving more than one tribe? How do you improve your identification efforts in terms of those people that may receive services on tribal lands but reside off tribal lands, or in many cases who have families in multiple communities and move back and forth? So how do you get the community involved in that process? You know, part of this is a service protocol, developing a protocol for how tribes can access and utilize your MDT. That's incredibly important. Part of doing that is identifying those stakeholders that we talked about before and sharing that information between tribal, federal, state, and local agencies, because at any given time, you know, one or more of those agencies may be touching your victim. And your MDT needs to be able to provide services to that victim no matter where they are encountered in the spectrum of jurisdiction and law enforcement and so forth. One of the keys to entering into an agreement and initiating in that assessment is meeting with tribal council. I always recommend this, and I'm welcome to feedback on successes in this area, but you have to understand that you're dealing with a sovereign entity and that meetings with tribal officials need to be approached with that in mind, and the same type of respect that you would show if you were going into another state capital, into another country's government, needs to be shown to the tribe. We don't just enter into tribal lands and begin operating without permission from the sovereign government of that community. In many cases, rules and procedures are going to be different than what you may be used to dealing with. So you're going to have to follow the rules of the tribe on how you access tribal organizations, agencies within the tribe, and tribal members. Always keep in mind that for tribes there may be seasons that are specific to religious or holidays where the tribe is closed to community members and where it's not appropriate to go on site. You need to understand these things ahead of time, and that's why it's so important to create those relationships with people from the community that are going to be your partners, that you can explain what it is that you wish to accomplish and how long you need to be there, who you want to interview, and then they can provide the guidance on the best way to do that. At the end of the day, I always tell people that you want to be a respectful guest, and you want to treat just as you would want somebody to treat if they came into your home, and that's so important. Who are you going to send to do your assessment? It's one of the issues that we run into very often, that your best subject matter expert may have no experience working on tribal lands. So the idea is that we partner. We have our people that are familiar with the capabilities of the team, of the Child Advocacy Center, and then we bring in that input from tribal members and stakeholders. We bring those partners with us so that we're entering into something where that we can be more effective and we can have better acceptance when we come into the community. I always like to find allies in the community who are willing to help encourage participation. You're professionals in the field of protecting children. Every one of you that's on here today is here because you care about children. You have members of that tribal community who share those concerns. The idea is to look at the people that are participating in this call today, to look at the tribe that you're dealing with, and find that ally and find that person that you can have personalized contact with that can help guide you through this process. And they can help you get buy-in from the community and get your assessment conducted so that you get real feedback from the community. Drafting a report, and this is no different than drafting a report anywhere else, but you have to understand that once your assessment is done and you understand what the barriers are in that community and you start thinking about the solutions and how you're going to work forward with that, you need to create that report that is going to come out and is going to outline your findings. You'll want to be able to illustrate what's happening currently in the community because we have to show where the gap is. We need to show what services are available now and then what we can do once our MDT is put into place. But you've got to be very respectful of past attempts. I could sit here and talk about a half dozen programs where we went into communities as a government or as a outside organization who meant really well and maybe provided initial funding or initial support for a program that then went away with the next budget cycle. And that program may have faltered or failed at no fault of the tribe or the people that tried to do it. And if we go in and start laying blame on something of that nature, you're going to build up resistance in the community. I always like to try visual interpretations of the data so you can show people practical examples of what's going to happen, charts, graphs, illustrations in the community, and make them so that they're applicable to the community that you're dealing with. Note your recommendations. Talk about where the process of MDT can help, but don't blame people. Don't lay blame on others. And expect pushback. There are going to be people in every community, whether it's tribal or not, that are going to be pushed back, and you need to be prepared for that. If you propose solutions, you offer sound recommendations, and if you bring the community into the process, then you're going to have a greater chance of success. There's a huge payoff here. The MDT brings that comprehensive approach that addresses underlying causes of victimization. There's so much need for that in these communities. And when you can combine the resources of an MDT with the strengths of a tribal community, that's where it comes together, and that's where we create this successful program. Time, resources, effort spent on prevention and recovery, those are all going to pay for themselves in the end if we can keep our children within our communities, protect them from further victimization. Those are the payoffs for what we're trying to do. And for each of you, this multidisciplinary approach, what you're doing is strengthening the community, and you're strengthening the way we protect children. That's incredibly important to what we're trying to do and what you're trying to do. And what it takes is a process by which you understand the challenges that you're facing, you learn about the community that you're going to serve, or I should say communities. You develop allies and partners in that community, and I think most importantly that you approach this process with respect and understanding. I put up this resources slide, and I do that because I want you to understand there are a lot of resources out there for this approach and for developing programs in tribal communities. Take the time to study the problems. Take the time to learn what's happening in the community where you're going to be working or that you're attempting to serve before you take that first step. Try not to go into it blind. Reach out for assistance and solutions from others, because what's going to happen is the more education that you have when you approach this process, the better you're going to be able to answer questions. What you don't want to do is come into the community and say, hey, we are here to develop this program, and then be blindsided by factors of jurisdiction or law that you were not aware of. And before I answer these last questions, I'll give you a prime example. I was working in a community that I went in and did an assessment, and I was trying to provide some guidance on developing a child protection program in that community. And we spent hours in meetings and had some really good concepts and had some pathways to funding a case management system for the tribe. But that case management system was dependent on the tribe having access to state law enforcement terminals. And after all this work we had done, I found out that the local sheriff would not allow the tribe access. Studying ahead, learning about where it is that you're going to be working can pay off tremendously. So, one of the questions that is faced is, and that was asked, was about traditional tribes and who makes that first contact. And the question was, wouldn't it be more effective to have an expert, a tribal expert, make that first approach? And I would say yes and no. In terms of absolutely, first approach should be made with somebody who is an expert, a member, or known to the tribe. But you have to be at the table too. Tribal leaders may already know the person that you're bringing forward to make that initial contact. And if it's your program, they're going to want to see you at the table, on the call, or in that first contact. I have a dear friend and mentor named Ron Gurley from Pryor, Oklahoma. And Ron and I spent years traveling around the country making contact with tribes. And Ron would guide me and teach me when to keep my mouth shut. But we always did it together. Because you have to accept responsibility for what it is you're bringing to the community and being part of that. But by all means, when you make that contact, have somebody with you or guiding you that can facilitate the right kind of contact. So, one of the issues that we so often get asked is that when I am dealing with tribal government, what do I do when there is a change in and tribal council or tribal leadership. And that as well is where these MOUs and MOAs come into place. By doing that, you can solidify this process. One of the things that we strongly recommend, and I know others like NACA recommends, is that you encourage the tribe to memorialize these programs in tribal resolutions and ordinances so that you can be sure that the program that you're going to support will carry on into the future. So I see that we're running towards the end of our time and our questions. I want to thank you personally, and I want to thank NCA and their staff for the opportunity to be with you today. And I'm always available to provide any assistance in our staff, and we're very pleased to be working with you and hope that we can assist you in the future. I want to thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for providing your insight and responding to our audience's questions. Before we close, I'd like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar and give a special thanks to Jim for joining us. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available in the coming weeks. So at this time, Allison, I'll turn the presentation back to you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Jim. As Melissa said, you can find this webinar on the NTTAC Online University in a few weeks. And if you need any more information, you can contact the National Criminal Justice Training Center at Sauk Valley Technical College. Or, of course, you can also contact OJJDP or NTTAC via the Help Desk by following the contact information that's on your slide. And we would also appreciate it if you could please take 5 minutes to fill out this survey. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.